All right, so many of y'all have been here before, so you know what the first part of this is like. Welcome to this 7th presentation in the first annual Contemporary Thoughts on Servant Leadership Speaker Series, brought to you by Servant Leadership Theory and Practice and the Turner College of Business's MSOL program. We have for you tonight Chris Wiggins, System CFO for the Hughston Clinic. Mr. Wiggins has been the CFO for the Hughston Clinic since 2014. He was the CFO for the Hughston Memorial Hospital in the same company in Phoenix, Alabama from 2011 to 2013. He served in various capacities at Columbus Bank and Trust for 8 years prior to joining Hughston. Chris received his bachelor's degree in business management from CSU in 2003, graduating summa cum laude. I've never had to say that before. Summa cum laude. And earned an MBA from Troy University, also summa cum laude, in 2006. Chris is involved or has played a leadership role in various civic organizations, including Solid Rock Assembly of God, the Exchange Club of Columbus, and the American Cancer Society. He informs me that he will be speaking tonight about the characteristics of a servant leader, discussing a case study from our very own servant leadership theory and practice, and we may, if time permits, do an exercise, unless y'all get engaged in just Q&A and we decide to go that route instead. That's all right, so, Chris Wiggins.
Thank you. Really appreciate being here. Again, I'm not a lecturer. I don't plan on standing here and just teaching you guys. I think you guys are all obviously engaged in the servant leadership world, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I'd like to interact with you a little bit, impart a little bit of what I've learned. What Dr. Phil didn't mention is I was actually part of the very first servant leadership class to go through the undergraduate program here at CSU. Started in '99 and graduated in '03. And so it's very near and dear to my heart. I'm really excited to see how far this program has come. We started with 15 undergraduate students. By the time I graduated, I think we only graduated about 10. Some people transferred and stuff. And now it's grown to, I know they have at least 60 that are in the official program, and then there's all these peripheral components, and now you've got a Master's of Servant Leadership. So obviously it's really neat to see the university grow from a servant leadership standpoint. I think it's very important. I think there's a lot of characteristics and things that you can learn. How many of you guys are working full-time right now? So a good mix, and the rest of you, I'd assume, are full-time students. So those of you that are in the work environment, I'm sure you see the value, and you've worked with leaders that are both good and bad at different things. And I'll share some of kind of what I've seen as I've kind of observed different leaders within our organization and with other organizations with which I've worked. I started, as Dr. Phil mentioned, with Columbus Bank and Trust, and it was a great transition for me coming out of the servant leadership program here to go to work for a company that embraced servant leadership. The CEO of the company at the time was a guy by the name of Jimmy Blanchard, who many of you probably know. He does a leadership forum here in Columbus every year, brings in speakers like John Maxwell and Ken Blanchard and a lot of leadership folks. And so he very much embraced servant leadership. We had a culture called Culture of the Heart. So it was very a people-oriented organization. Bill Turner, who was integral in starting the program here at CSU, was on the board of directors for CB&T when I started to work there. So it was really neat to be able to go to work for an organization that really embraced that right out of the gate and allowed me to take what I had learned in school and trying to apply that as a young manager in a bank branch. So it was really a lot of fun. These are the topics we're going to talk about. Dr. Phil mentioned some of these. You know, what is servant leadership? I'm not going to probably tell you anything you don't know. I'm going to try and add a different perspective with some of the stories and stuff, hopefully, that I can share with you guys. I know you've already had a speech from one of the speakers on the hierarchy and the pyramid, but I'm going to kind of give my take on that. How do you practice servant leadership? There's some information actually in a recent journal that Dr. Phil and his team put together that kind of talk about the challenges with that in the corporate environment. The characteristics of a servant leader, we'll talk about that. I'll give some of my favorite examples of servant leaders, some of which you probably have already talked about. And then, as Dr. Phil mentioned, there's a case study that was published in about the Cleveland Clinic. That was in one of the servant leadership journals here from CSU. It's near and dear to my heart because it is a healthcare related case study. That's the background I'm in, so there's a lot of relevance to what I see in the healthcare environment. And so we'll talk about that. And then if we have time at the end, there's a team building exercise we may try. It just depends on how much time we have left because we'll need about 20 minutes to do it. So if we have time, we'll do that at the very end. To tell you a little bit about Hughston before I get started into my presentation, a lot of people don't know, and I'll talk a little bit about Hughston as we go through the presentation. Everybody sees our clinic on Veterans Parkway and they think that's it, that's Hughston Clinic, that's all. But we're actually in close to 20 locations in Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. We own the 70-bed hospital facility in Phoenix City. We've got a 2-bed surgery center. We've got a foundation that does a lot of research and development in the healthcare environment. And we're growing, and with growth comes challenges, and you've got to have great leaders to be able to grow the right way and to take a culture that you want, i.e. like I mentioned Synovus and their culture of the heart. That was developed over a long period of time. It took a lot of strong leaders to do that. And so when you get in an environment where you're growing in different states and everybody's spread out, there's a lot of importance in having a great culture that can permeate those outlier locations. I saw a couple of little funny cartoons, if you will. 2 ladies standing outside the boss's office. His idea of servant leadership is we serve, he leads. That's kind of the top-down mentality. I remember early on in my banking career, what I noticed was that some of the leaders in the bank were so disconnected from the front end of what was going on. They didn't know how to do what the employees were doing. They didn't know how to do the work the employees were doing. And so there was not much respect of those folks that actually didn't understand and couldn't do what those folks were doing. And one thing I committed to early on was I'm going to learn how they do everything so that I can get in the ditch with them and we can work together, and to try and earn that credibility with folks that I work with, because that was something I really noticed. And that is kind of what this is here, is the boss is telling everybody else what to do, and they're there to serve his needs, which is not the servant leadership mentality. And this is another one. Believe me, fellows, everyone from Pharaoh on down is an equally valued member of the team. Kind of all talk, no action here. You can see the guy that's, I guess, supposed to be the leader sitting on top, you know, letting everybody serve his needs and telling everybody, way to go, we're all in this together, but he's dead weight on top of what they're pulling. Most of you in here, probably all of you in here, know who coined the term servant leadership, which was Robert Greenleaf. Obviously, he was an executive for AT&T. He did a lot of great things. I've learned a lot about him over the years in my study of servant leadership. Things that I didn't know. There were things that he did within his organization. Apparently, he promoted the first females within his organization. Outside of just menial tasks, he gave them more leadership roles. He also promoted the first minorities within his organization. So he was practicing leadership in a corporate environment before he ever started the Servant Leadership Institute that is still present today. He actually left and retired AT&T in 1964, and he started the Greenleaf Institute about that time. And he's published many articles of serving as leader. In 1970, he had several essays that he published. And so a lot of the current day ideology of servant leadership is based on what Robert Greenleaf started, which is totally opposite, obviously, of these 2 cartoons I've shown you. So what is servant leadership and how is it different? Some of you talk to me. What have you learned so far in servant leadership that makes it different from your traditional styles of leadership? And there's some quotes and some things up there that you guys may have seen.
servant leaders concerned with their relationship and personal development instead of just the task?
Sure. Concern with relationship and development versus just a task. You know, a lot of times leaders or people think, you know, the typical mindset is, I want to be a leader and that's all I want to do is I want to lead, before they ever think about serving. And servant leadership kind of flips that, right? That paradigm. It says, you know, I want to serve and I'm serving, and just by happenstance or by serving, I become a leader and people look to me as a leader. And so it's kind of shifting that focus to where I'm not going into a situation saying, I'm going in here and I'm going to be your leader, dadgummit, and that's what's going to happen. I mean, it's about, you know, serving first, and then by serving, you earn that respect. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the bosses that, you know, I've seen, or people that I've seen that have struggled in leadership, is that they didn't understand the front line. It was about them being a leader, and look, I got people that handle that for me. They'll just do that, you know, and it's about them serving that person, which is totally opposite of this mindset. So, of course, there's several questions that Robert Greenleaf said are important to determine if servant leadership is occurring. One is, do those served grow as persons? So what that means to me is, am I training people? Am I teaching people? Is it, you know, going back to the point of what she just made, you know, is it about the people and about them growing, or is it just about a task? One thing that, you know, again, going back to what I learned early on, I want to learn what everybody that works with me does. Not that I can do everything they do and jump in and do it as efficiently as them, because there's not enough hours in the day to do that. So don't get me wrong. And you can easily get over into micromanagement if you go too far that direction. But what I'm saying is, you have to have an understanding of what they're going through to be able to help them, and for them to know that you're going to get in the ditch with them. And one thing I've learned is, if I'll take a task that I have that I'm handing down and I'll teach them about why they're doing it, versus just saying, hey, do this and perform this calculation and do it like this and turn it back into me, you know, letting them know why they're doing it and how important it is to the organization and what they're doing. In the long run, it not only helps that person, it helps me as well, because then I don't have to go back and tell them again and again and again. They understand it, they get it, and they're growing at the same time. Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants, which is kind of the same concept? Are they able to start doing things on their own? One thing I learned in my undergraduate program is that servant leadership is not welfare. It is about making people become servants themselves. It's not a handout. It's not you just saying, hey, I'm going to continue to provide for you and provide for you and provide for you and provide for you without expectations. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I found an interesting quote in the most recent Servant Leadership Journal that kind of struck me in regards to that, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But, you know, we got to make sure people are growing and they're becoming autonomous. And what's the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit or at least not be further deprived? So in what you're doing, are people, you know, benefiting in some way, or at least not being deprived of something else as you're helping, as you're performing your roles? So the hierarchy, and I know you guys had a speaker that probably dove into this in a lot more detail, so we'll be high level on this. You know, you can see in the traditional hierarchy, you've got somebody at the top that's responsible and everybody else is responsive to that person. They tell everybody what to do. Employees are responsive to the boss. People work for you. I lead you kind of mentality. Versus the servant leadership mentality, which is the boss is at the bottom being responsive to the needs of their followers. So people work with you. Leaders are here to make their lives better. It doesn't, you know, work without the right team. You need to have a team that takes actions and you know, works together for an outcome. So it's more of a team approach than it is somebody that's just directing and telling everybody what to do, and authoritative or more like a dictatorship from the first standpoint. What did you guys learn? I'm sure you guys talked about this in great detail with the previous speaker. Who all was here for that speech about the pyramids and the shifts.
So what he did was the same thing, but his whole talk was eras of his career and how that kind of worked for him. So it was more individually based.
Okay. Have any of you experienced one way or the other? Have you been in an environment where you've worked under somebody who's more in the traditional sense and somebody who's more in the servant leadership sense? Does anybody have an example that they'd be willing to share? Yes, sir.
Well, when I used to work at Walmart, I used to work in electronics, and electronics are constantly evolving, so a lot of the older managers really didn't know too much about the cell phone stuff or anything like that. I was working with cell phones, doing contracts, and they really didn't know what was going on, so there'd be times when they're telling us to do certain things that you can't do, and they're just just do this, and it's just you can't. You would understand that if they actually would be
took time.
Took time to learn it, but then where I work now, my boss, I'm a server, and when we get in trouble or anything like that, or not in trouble, but I would say it starts getting really busy, he'll actually get out, start moving plates, helping clear plates, stuff like that. He'll actually help out with stuff like that, so a little bit more hands-on.
Perfect. That's a perfect example. And so, it goes back to what I'm saying. I'm sure you would say you respect that second manager, the one you have now, a whole lot more than the first, and more willing to bend over backwards to do more things for that person. Yeah, it definitely changes your mindset about a person when you have an environment like that allows you to grow. So this is something that Dr. Phil and I were kind of talking around before the class started. One of the quotes I've seen over and over again is that servant leadership remains an underdeveloped phenomenon in the sense that it is yet to be packaged into a set of replicable best management practices. And I think a lot of people are out there trying to do that. There's actually an article in this servant leadership theory and practice, and I'd encourage you, I know you guys you have a lot of reading and stuff to do, but there's times where you're doing papers and research. There's a lot of good information in here, and you got some folks that are working really hard on this, and that's free advertising because I wasn't told to say that. But this is really good stuff, and there's some deep stuff in here too. So I think there's some stuff that's more high level, and there's some stuff that's really deep in there. But there are some people that are trying really hard to develop best practices and to take what is this theory and put it into practice. One of the things I found interesting, and I'll read this quote, and this is a case study that was about the VA, and one of the things it says about when they were trying to figure out how to scale, servant leadership in a quantifiable measurement. Because so many times we talk about servant leadership and trying to implement it, and we talk about the warm, fuzzy, and the people side of it, which it is about people. It is. But that doesn't mean you don't have expectations, and that doesn't mean you don't set goals, and that doesn't mean you don't have standards. I think servant leadership, I don't think it's really that complicated. It's really not. I think it's a lifestyle. I think it's something that you just live every day. I mean, I can apply it to my marriage. I can apply it to my children and how I interact with them, and I can apply it in the business world. But I thought that was so telling that a lot of times people talk about servant leadership and they say servant leadership is soft, or it's just this one, that's not for me. It doesn't mean you exclude the expectations. I still love my kids, but I have expectations for them, and I expect them to perform and do well. And so the same thing with the people I work with. I have expectations for them. There's goals. They're clear. I communicate them. We talk about their future. What do they want in life? Where are they going? And we develop a plan for them to get there. And that is very important. And that's something that in order to replicate it in management practices, that's something that we have to hit on. And that's something that they're trying to hit on with this VA case study. I encourage you to go back and read it. It's an interesting case study. It is pretty deep. There's some numbers in there that you might want to skip over because I even glossed over those, but it was good. Greenleaf actually warned of this because he said it was an unorthodox approach. Again, we've got to develop cultures where followers become servant leaders, so it's growing and making them more autonomous. Stephen Covey, and how many of you have heard of Covey? I'm sure maybe some of you have. He's got a lot of leadership information out there. But one of the things he talked about, he gives an analogy, and I remember this from when I was in my undergrad. It's one of the stories that stick out to me. But he uses this analogy of a group of producers cutting their way through the jungle with machetes. They're the problem solvers, they're the producers, they're the ones clearing it out. Managers are behind them, sharpening the machetes, writing policies, holding muscle, development plans, bringing improved technologies, and setting up schedules. But he says the leader is the one who climbs the tallest tree, surveys the entire situation, and yells, "Wrong jungle." But how do busy, efficient producers and managers respond? Shut up, we're making progress. So I thought that's a good visualization as we go into these characteristics of, you know, the difference between a manager and somebody in the day-to-day and getting stuck in the weeds, and a leader who can take and survey a situation. You know, I heard Dr. Phil talking about Sean early on, and he's kind of the guy moving the puzzle pieces and a graduate of the program. That's kind of how I see the leader. They're kind of behind the scenes. You as, you know, followers and stuff, you're growing and becoming more autonomous while that's happening. You don't even realize those puzzle pieces are moving. So I think that's a good visualization of a leader. These characteristics I actually pulled from the Pastoral Forum. They were adopted from some Greenleaf material that was actually in a video presentation that he did. I want to give credit to that. I didn't make these up, but I'll add my spin on it just so you know where these came from. The first, and this is something you hear with leadership across the board, I don't think it's just servant leadership, is listening. Hearing is passive, listening is active. You know, it requires a commitment to listen to people. I'm guilty of, and I have been in the past, of already thinking about what I'm going to say next. And I think a lot of us do that when we're talking to people. We're like, what am I going to say next? It's really hard. You've got to maintain that eye contact, and that's something I have to concentrate on to try and really absorb what somebody's saying. But listening is an important part, because I promise you, you don't know everything. I don't care how smart you are. I don't know everything. And so there's people that work for me that are a whole lot smarter than I am. They can figure out how to do things a whole lot quicker than I can and more efficiently. And if I'm not listening to them, I'm going to fail. And so I think that's a very important characteristic. Empathy. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? Somebody tell me.
Empathy is understanding, and sympathy is you understand and you are on their side. Yeah.
You're putting yourself in their shoes, so to speak. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's important too, because it goes back, again, I keep going back to what I said early on about understanding what somebody's going through. Is putting yourself in their shoes, really being able to say, okay, how are they going to take this? One thing I think about, and I have to negotiate a lot in my role, both with people internally, externally, contracts, payers, Medicare, oh my gosh. You know, we negotiate with a lot of people in the business. And one thing I've tried to do when I'm doing that is to try and put myself in their shoes. Okay, how are they going to view this? How can I create a win-win? Truly a win-win. And people say that a lot. This is a win-win, but it's so one-sided. It's 100% going their way. But how can I create a win-win? Because if I can figure out how they're going to take it and I can put myself in their shoes, I have a whole lot higher chance of being successful than I would if I don't. Healing, which is a weird one in leadership. You don't normally see that, but what the point they're making is that every person, basically you hear people come to work with their own problems and situations and things going on. And so servant leaders know that. They're aware of that. They have an awareness about that. They know people are coming with their own situations and things. And they work to restore wholeness. One thing we say at our work, we call our employees the Hughston family. And when there are situations that arise, we try and take care of them. Because it's hard to focus on your job if you're worried about something. If you're worried about, you know, you just got kicked out of your house and you don't know how you're going to pay the bill. We had an employee down in Florida last year as we're growing. She had just been on with us a few months and had a situation, really wasn't her fault, was down on her luck, didn't have a place to live. And it's one of those things where we were able to figure out a way to help her. And I think that's no kudos to me. There was a bunch of people in our organization that was figuring that out, how to make that work. But that's an example that I can think of how that comes into play in a work environment. Because there are a lot of situations. We had a young man last year, 35 years old, I think, died of cancer. That was a tough time for our Hughston family. But we came together, we realized what they were going through, and a lot of our guys, you know, put together a scholarship fund for his child and did a lot of things. That's something that people, they will bend over backwards to help you. They will, I mean, that is servant leadership at its best, I think, is when you're able to see a need and you're able to meet that and realize that, you know, some of these things are bigger than work, they're bigger than yourself, and you just got to have an awareness to that. Awareness is the next thing, the ability to see things as they really are. But I also think about awareness, I think about awareness of who I am. You know, you got to be aware of who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are. How many of you have taken different assessments of yourself? I'm sure, I know that was a lot of what we did. I got tired of these ENFTJs and all this other stuff and all these letters. I can't even remember what I was anymore. But what I learned from all of that is there were certain things that I had to realize that I'm weak in. So I have to really concentrate and focus on that as a leader. And I think it's important for you to understand where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are, so you can leverage your strengths and you can focus on your weaknesses. You know, I know one of my strengths, I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to work and stuff. And one of the assessments I said that I know how to take different pieces of a puzzle, like different relationships that I have. So if I know, hey, I don't know how to figure that out, but I know 10 people that do. So I know that's my strength, is I pull people together and I figure out who to put in and plug in to fix that problem. And knowing that helps me when I go into a problem to say, okay, I know why I'm thinking this way now, and then I can leverage that strength to better fix a problem. Persuasion versus coercion. Somebody else give me the difference between persuasion versus coercion. Somebody in the back. Y'all are falling asleep back there, so. Somebody in the back, tell me the difference. I'm just kidding, they're not falling asleep, I'm joking. Nobody's falling asleep. Yes, sir?
Coercion is using some sort of force to get compliance, where persuasion is convincing someone.
That's right. Why is persuasion better?
Because they want to. It's not that they're trying to do it to avoid pain or avoid something else. They actively want to do
Bingo. Bingo. That's a perfect answer. Couldn't have said it better myself. Because now they want to do it. They don't feel like you're putting them in some sort of death grip to do what you want them to do. They want to do it because now they understand and they get it. So I think that's an important characteristics. Conceptualization, this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about with the Covey example. It's being able to look at a problem and think beyond the day-to-day. My boss now, our CEO, is a huge strategic big picture thinker. And I can get there, but sometimes I need somebody to pull me there. I can get in the weeds and really get bogged down and really get to worried about the day-to-day. And sometimes I need somebody to pull me out and conceptualize things so I understand. So that's an important one, and it goes back to the awareness, and it all kind of ties together, that if you're aware that you're not a big picture person, but you've got somebody around you that is, they can pull you out of that day-to-day. Like sometimes some of you probably freak out about an exam and forget the big picture of what you're trying to learn. You're just trying to memorize stuff instead of letting it absorb into you so that you can use it later. It's kind of a good example for students, you know. So it's a great, I think Covey covered it very well as far as a great picture of conceptualization versus managers being in that day-to-day. Foresight, the ability to view a likely outcome of a situation. So foresight, the way I think about it, is being able to take like history and what's going on in the present and apply it going forward so you understand what's going to happen in a situation. So leaders are really good, servant leaders are really good with foresight. Stewardship. So we have to be good stewards of the resources we're given. I've been very blessed to be in the positions that I've been in and to have the success I've had. But one thing I've learned is you've got to be good stewards of everything you're given. And that's not just, that includes your talent. That includes the people that you're blessed to have working with you. That includes the money, if you're overseeing money, which is my case. I have to oversee the money coming in and going out. I have to be good steward of that. You know, so it's a number of different resources you have to be good stewards of. And a good steward, and this will kind of tie in with number 10, so I'll kind of skip down, in the community. One interesting, and I thought it was a good analogy, our youth pastor at church talked about this. He talked about how some of our teenage students were coming to him saying that they don't feel connected. And he said, well, are you serving in some capacity? Because people that serve typically are more connected. And the analogy he used was a restaurant. So you go into a restaurant and you sit down and everybody comes and waits on you and they do everything and you pay and you leave. You're not connected to that restaurant. You're just there to eat and to be given a service, but you don't take ownership in that restaurant. You don't, if it's not there tomorrow, oh well, it doesn't matter. But when you serve, when you're on the other side and you take ownership in it, it changes your perspective. And I think the same thing in community with servant leadership. Dr. Phil mentioned some of the things I'm doing in my community. I figure out what I'm passionate about and I try to plug in, because if I'm connected in the community, I'm more connected in everything else that I do and more focused on everything I do. The Cancer Society is one of the things I'm very involved in, very passionate about it. I also like to play golf, so I figured out how to kind of tie those two together. I'm chair of the golf committee and have helped them raise money that way. And so it's a great way to tie in two passions that I have and really helps me to stay focused on what's important. And then finally, and this is something we've hit on time and time again, is the continue to focus on the growth of people. So we have to look at those around us. We have to, again, train them, teach them, help them to become more autonomous, and do everything in our power to nurture our employees to help them grow personally, spiritually, you know, from a professional standpoint. You know, I encourage my folks to get additional education and to continue to learn and to provide opportunities for them to grow within our organization. So let's talk about some of the leaders, and I can't start a list, and it doesn't matter, you know, this has nothing to do with religion, although I am a Christian, but even if you're not, you can look at Jesus Christ and you can see a servant leader, because he even says in Matthew that he came into the world to serve. And so with him being a servant, he became a leader by being a servant, to get thousands of people to follow him. Now millions of people, you know, look to his example. It's a great example of somebody who was a servant leader. Mother Teresa, many of you know who Mother Teresa is. She helped the poor. She lived in India most of her life. She started a lot of charities. She started the Missionaries of Charity in 1950. I think they started with like 13 members. They have over 4,000 today. So she left a lot of ripples. She mentions, I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. I think that's a good example of tying back into healing, the healing aspect of she saw a need and she realized people had a big need and applied that healing characteristic. Martin Luther King Jr., I think he had a lot of conceptualization and foresight to see a vision and a dream for what he thought our country could be and for this great divide and how we could bridge that gap. And he was a huge reason why, you know, many minorities in our country have the rights that they have today. And so I think he's a good example as I tie into the characteristics of foresight and conceptualization. Truett Cathy, how many of you know who that is? Everybody knows Chick-fil-A, right? We're in Chick-fil-A country. Everybody's had some nuggets from there. It's great. He stayed true to his values since he started the company. I'm not going to open on Sunday. I'm going to close on Sunday because that's what I believe. I believe that's the day of rest. He stayed true to that. Another thing that this man has done is he's created a scholarship program for his employees. He does a ton of charity work, or his company does, in communities that they're in. I'm sure many of you have been a part of something where they donate sales and you go up there and you buy a sandwich, you tell them you're there for whatever school or whatever organization, and they donate sales to that organization. That's stewardship to me. This guy was blessed with a great company. I mean, he created just a simple chicken sandwich, and there's no telling how many millions of dollars. He could just hold himself up and been selfish, but he's been a good steward of the resources that he's been given, which is why I think he's a great example of a servant leader. And then Abraham Lincoln, of course, he preserved the Union, abolished slavery. I mean, just another great example of foresight, conceptualization, seeing a need, and growing. Somebody add one. Somebody add one. Ad hoc. Let's do it. Somebody's got another one that you've talked about.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Why would you say that?
She was very active in the civil rights movement, worked a lot at grassroots organizations, traveled around the country, connecting with people, doing work, like not telling other people like, hey, I'll be your leader, but like going there and helping other people create organizations. And yeah, nobody really knows her as a powerful figure because she worked in support of other people instead of putting herself at the head of it.
Right. Somebody got one more before we move on? Come on, somebody's got another one. You guys are servant leadership gurus, man. Come on.
Well, Gandhi is often on the list.
Yeah, Gandhi's a good one. I mean, he saw a need. He willing to give his life, hunger strikes and everything else. I mean, that's a great example. So this is the case study. Again, I'll reference back to the servant leadership. It was from the Theory and Practice, Volume 2, Issue 1, pages 36 through 48. It was in the February 2015 edition. Joseph Patronchak, I think I'm saying that name right. He was the former CHRO, or Chief Human Resources Officer for Cleveland Clinic. He helped put this together along with the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, so I want to give credit to them. But what I want to go through now is a case study in a real-life environment where they saw a need, they applied servant leadership characteristics to this need and saw the results related to it. So I think it's very important. We talked about measuring results. It's always good to know your baseline so that you can kind of measure it later on to see how much you progress, and that's what they did in this case study. And everybody, who's heard of the Cleveland Clinic? It's a very renowned clinic. They're very well known for their prowess in medicine. But in 2008, they felt their patient experience was falling well below their clinical results. So they've always had great clinical results, but their patient experience wasn't so great. There's a metric called the HCAHPS, which is something that hospitals know a lot about. It's called the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers. And essentially what it is a 21-question survey that patients answer about your organization that can affect your Medicare payment. So it's very important to hospitals and healthcare facilities to know that metric. And basically a lot of it revolves around communication. So if you don't feel like you were well communicated to or people were empathetic to your needs when you're in the hospital and stuff, you're going to get poor scores on your survey, and it could lead to a reduction in your Medicare payments, which is a huge payer. It represents in a lot of cases 40–50% of medical payments, so it could have a drastic impact on your organization. Gallup has stated that hospitals with higher levels of engagement also register higher HCAHPS domain performance. Seems pretty realistic. Seems like a good hypothesis that, you know, higher engagement leads to better HCAHPS scores, because if my employees are engaged in what they're doing, they're going to listen better to patients. They're going to take their needs seriously. They're going to do things to make us successful from that standpoint. They have a ratio that they developed, and this is where it's kind of funny to me when I think about how they come up with numbers and how they measure a patient's engagement versus a disengaged, employee. But apparently the world-class organization ratio for engaged to actively disengaged employee is 9.5 to 1. So you have 9.5 employees to every one employee that's actively disengaged. And I'm sure there's surveys and different things they do to figure out how you're actively disengaged. The Cleveland Clinic was at 2.5 to 1. So for every one employee they had that was disengaged from the mission and values and core business structure that they were trying to accomplish, they had 2.5 that were actually engaged, which would speak to those results. So this chief HR officer said, let's come up with a new people strategy and try to change the culture. And so what they wanted from this whole strategy was for leaders to care about them and treat them with respect. They wanted the organization or the employees to work under the mission of the organization and be connected to the mission. And an organization offers opportunities for personal and professional development. Sounds familiar with characteristics that we've talked about. Sounds familiar with what we've went through so far. So the typical leadership model has been top down. before this change. So it was more like the pyramid we saw early on. And so what they saw as the lowest rated categories in the survey that they did was, I have a best friend at work, so people weren't connecting to other folks at work. I have received recognition or praise in the last 7 days, so they weren't being recognized for what they were doing. At my work, my opinion seems to count, so they weren't being listened to. There is someone at work who encourages my development, so they weren't growing. So they started implementing with key members of the executive leadership team, and I'm sure they had an overwhelming amount of support. Probably not. Because when you go in and you try and implement a new culture and you bring more stuff to the table, people see it as that, just more stuff that I have to do to get through my day, and it makes no sense. So they had a big hurdle to overcome. They followed their groundwork with a presentation to the entire executive team. They had several small group and informal meetings. So they had these different benchmarks and deadlines that they were meeting for these different meetings that they were having. And I can relate to this. The physicians weren't all supportive. And God bless you if you ever work with physicians. I mean, they're great folks. They do a lot of good. But they're busy people. And if you stack anything on, if it takes them 2 more seconds, you're going to hear about it. But this one said, hey, in my OR, I'm in charge, period. That's the way it has to be, and that's the way it is. And now you expect me to also be a servant leader. Come on. And I could hear them saying it. Most of the reaction was positive, however. And in the fall of 2008, they hired this company called Third Rivers Partners. And there was a guy that worked for them that I think was very well versed in servant leadership. Reading some of his comments, that was Ken Jennings. He talked about the characteristics of a servant leader: upending the pyramid, builds on strengths, raises the bar, blazes the trail, and runs to great purpose, which all sounds familiar to what we've been talking about. Using this model, implementation began with servant leader focused coaching of the executive leadership team, followed by the 400 plus directors they have. They have thousands and thousands of employees at Cleveland Clinic. Servant leadership principles were introduced into the mentoring program for physicians. So what they realized was they had to permeate this culture throughout. They had to hit it, at multiple levels. They had to hit it in different training. It had to be part of the culture. It couldn't just say, hey, we're going to be a servant leadership culture, and I've got this one guy who believes in servant leadership, and he's going to model it for you. There has to be tracking. There has to be principles and stuff in place. And so what they did is they started servant leader competencies. So I'm sure they had different courses and different things on their intranet at work that they could take with leading through mission and values, performance management. They had servant leader training for all their managers and supervisors. So they sat in a session like we're sitting, they talked about it, they learned about it, and they talked about how they implemented it. Servant leader in a box, toolkit, metrics, community practice, executive rounding. So they implemented all these great things to teach people about servant leadership. And one thing that was really cool that emerged out of all this was their motto. And they needed to come up with a mission and a motto they could all get behind. And what's great about servant leadership in healthcare is it's a great tie. Because people that get into healthcare for the right reason, they're there to serve patients. That's what nurses are there to do. That's what physicians are there to do. Good nurses, good physicians, they're in it for that reason. Not to make a bunch of money. They're in it to serve patients. We are all caregivers working together to ensure the well-being of our patient, and each of us plays a valuable role in fulfilling that mission. Employees are now all called caregivers. Doesn't matter if it's the janitor, doesn't matter if it's somebody working in the cafeteria, they're all caregivers because they're all part of that patient experience. The results of their survey after the fact were that the greatest increase in mean across the enterprise were for, I have a best friend at work. I have received recognition or praise in the last 7 days. At work, my opinions seem to count. There's someone at work who encourages my development. By 2013, the ratio of engaged to actively disengaged employees increased to 10.2 to 1. So now they're above this world-class figure of 9.57 to 1. And the HCAP scores improved dramatically. And you'll see the correlation here, and it's a black and white chart, so I apologize for that. But you'll see the top line is the engagement, and the bottom line is HCAP. So you can see the correlation between the two and how they tie so perfectly together. I think this is a great case study because it actually shows how practical it is. Even though we said it's difficult to find ways to do it, if you make it part of your culture and you create an environment where people are constantly learning, well, that's part of the expectation. We do, and those of you that are working full-time, I'm sure you do this, where you have annual evaluations or we call it high-performing organization analysis with our team, with our directors and managers. We do that on a quarterly basis so that we're constantly morphing and changing our goals and directives and everything else and talking about their growth and what they want to do and continuously having that conversation. That's got to be in your culture for it to work. If you just tell somebody to do it, they're just not going to do it. There's got to be that constant follow-up. And that's why I say it's, we talk a lot about the people side, and it is about the people, but you can't forget the number side and talk about the measurement of that, to hold people accountable to that's something that is an expectation and that you want to accomplish. So, we've got like 15 minutes. Think we've got time to rush it out real quick? I think we can have a team real quick. I think we've got about probably 40 to 50 people in here. So if you can kind of huddle up with between 10 and 12 people, I'm going to pass out some stuff real quick. And we're going to do this fast. We're going to do a team building exercise, and then we'll ask a few questions at the end and we'll finish up. That way maybe some of you will wake up before your great follow-up with Dr. Phil. So here's the phone book. And here's the instructions up here. So your objective here, and we're going to give you about 5 minutes because we're going to make it fast because then we'll have to wind up with some questions. You will need to develop a roadway with a bridge with the materials I gave you. It's got to be able to support the weight of this phone book, and it's got to be high enough where this phone book can pass vertically underneath. Okay? So I'll walk around with the phone book while you're doing this if you want to test it. And then there's got to be a creative design feature to it. So talk about it. It's going to be a quick one.
I mean, I can go bigger, yeah.
Take about 4 more minutes. 4 minutes. Got one more to test?
All right, guys, on the last one, so we got to test whatever you got.
Whatever you got.
Okay, all right.
So 2 pass? Great.
This was one and that was one.
Hey, I'll call you back together because I know I'm out of time. I was only supposed to allot it till 7, so I don't like going over. It's like the preacher that says they're closing like 4 times and they don't actually close. But the main thing with this experience is not necessarily about actually building it and being successful. It's about taking, what you learned and seeing different leadership styles. So what we would do if we had more time is really talk about it. So one thing you can think about is what stood out to you, who kind of took the lead, how did you use your skill set in coming in and helping to be a leader within the group. Some people might have sat back, some people might have stepped in and done stuff, some people might have heard some of the professors talking about how some of the groups might have been too big and you felt like, well, I can't get involved, so I'm just going to quit. And so you can actually take all of that and apply it to what you see in work environments as well. And so that was the whole point of the exercise. Listen, guys, I just want to tell you guys, I really appreciate you letting me come talk to you. I really do. I'm proud of CSU and this university. I'm proud that we have great students like you guys going through this and trying to learn and better yourself on a Thursday night when March Madness is about to start. That's where I'm about to go. But I really appreciate you guys. And listen, if there's ever anything I can do for you guys, Dr. Phil has my contact information. We'd love to help you if we can.